Her name Nykeria Jude.
Precious little girl, and now a story you'll only see on your news leader. The 6-year-old girl who was wounded during a deadly triple shooting last Friday in Tunica County is speaking out. That little girl was released from Le Bonheur Children's Hospital today.
Brave little girl.
Hello, I'm Greg Hurst.
I'm Stephanie Skurlock. WREG's Brian Didlake spoke with her and the family after she received a special convoy of police escorts all the way home.
The first call came on July 28, 15, 10 years before Nykeria Jude died on the floor of her home at 1060 Soleil Drive in Robinsonville, Mississippi. Someone picked up a phone and called the Tunica County Sheriff's Office about a domestic disturbance at that address. Markello Braxton and Nykeria Jude, the same address, the same two people. The beginning of a documented record that would grow call by call, year by year across an entire decade, until 7 entries existed in the files of the Tunica County Sheriff's Office describing 7 moments when the situation inside that home on Soleil Drive was serious enough to warrant law enforcement involvement. The 7th call was on March 10, 2025, 4 months before July 11th. The 8th moment did not produce a call by the time the call came in at 7:06 in the evening on July 11th, 2025. Nykeria Jude was already beyond the reach of anything a dispatcher could send. The Tunica County Coroner, Glenn Grant, pronounced her dead at the scene. She was 30 years old. She was the mother of a 6-year-old girl named Markello, and Markello was at that same address when it happened. A child who would spend the next several days in the pediatric intensive care unit at Le Bonheur Children's Hospital in Memphis, while her mother was gone and her father was somewhere in the woods behind the houses on Soleil Drive. This is the story of Nykeria Jude, of Markello, of 10 years of documented calls, and the specific and devastating question that every case like this one demands we ask: what does a system do with 7 calls across 10 years? What intervention is possible? What intervention was attempted? And what happens to the families inside these situations when the intervention that arrives, call after call, year after year, is not the kind of intervention that changes what is building behind a closed door? Welcome to the Crime Files TV. This channel covers the cases that matter, the stories from Black American communities that deserve the full picture, told with the depth and the respect that real human beings and real human loss deserve. Subscribe now if you are not already here. This case is about more than one night in Robinsonville. It is about 10 years. Now let's start from the beginning. Robinsonville, Mississippi sits in Tunica County in the northwest corner of the state, in the flat delta farmland that stretches along the Mississippi River. Tunica County is one of the poorest counties in the United States by almost any economic measure, a reality shaped by a history of agricultural economy, racial inequality, and the slow departure of the industries that once sustained communities across the delta. The opening of casino resorts along the river in the 1990s changed the economic landscape of the county in specific ways, bringing jobs and visitors but not fundamentally altering the deeper structural realities of life for most people who called Tunica County home. Robinsonville is part of that landscape, a community with its own rhythms, its own people, its own long memory of what it means to build a life in one of the most historically underserved corners of Mississippi. Nykeria Jude was 30 years old. She was, by all accounts in the public record of this case, the kind of person that a community builds itself around without always recognizing that it is doing so. She had a 6-year-old daughter named Markello Braxton, a child described by the people around her as the center of her mother's world. The relationship between Nykeria and Markello Braxton was what people who knew them described to FOX13 as on and off. That phrase, on and off, is the specific language that people reach for when they are trying to describe a relationship that does not fit the clean binary of together or not together. A relationship that cycles, that has periods of proximity and periods of distance and periods where the two people involved are navigating something that neither of them has fully named or resolved. An on and off relationship across the span of years during which a child is born and grows from an infant to a 6-year-old is not simply a romantic dynamic. It is a co-parenting reality. It is a shared life that cannot be fully separated because the child in the middle of it connects both people to each other, regardless of what their romantic status is at any given moment. Markello Braxton was 41 years old. He was the father of Markello. He was also the father of Marquavius Young. a 24-year-old man who was present at 1060 Soleil Drive on the evening of July 11th. 2 children by different mothers. One man whose documented relationship with Nykeria Jude had produced 7 calls to the Tunica County Sheriff's Office across 10 years. The first of those calls was on July 28, 2015. Markello was not yet born. The documented history between Nykeria and Braxton predates their daughter. Whatever brought law enforcement to that address for the first time in the summer of 2015 was the beginning of a pattern that investigators, reporters, and advocates would later look at and identify as a textbook escalation arc, not because each individual call produced clear evidence of what was coming, but because the pattern of calls across time, the consistency of the address, the consistency of the 2 people named, the consistency of the category of call, creates a picture that, viewed across the full 10-year span, reads with a terrible clarity that each individual entry in the record does not produce alone. 7 calls, July 2015, and then again, and then again, and then on March 10, 2025, 4 months before the night everything ended on Soleil Drive. The most recent documented disturbance at that address was 4 months before Nykeria Jude was killed there. That is not a gap between the documented history and the lethal event. It is a near-continuous documented history up to the edge of the lethal event. And that proximity between the last call and the last moment is what makes the systemic conversation this case demands so urgent. On the evening of July 11, 2025, a summer Friday in Robinsonville, something happened inside the home at 1060 Soleil Drive. Something that escalated from whatever its beginning was to the point where shots were fired. 3 people were in the path of those shots. Nykeria Jude, 30 years old. Markello Braxton, 6 years old, in her own home on a Friday evening. And Marquavius Young, 24 years old, the older son whose presence at that address on that night put him in the middle of something he had not anticipated surviving. At 7:06 in the evening, someone called 911. Shots fired at 1060 Soleil Drive. The Tunica County Sheriff's Office dispatched deputies. Pafford EMS arrived alongside them. When they entered the residence, they found 3 victims with gunshot wounds. Nykeria Jude was the first focus of the paramedics who arrived, but the severity of her injuries was beyond what emergency response at the scene could address. Tunica County Coroner Glenn Grant arrived and pronounced her deceased. She was 30 years old. Her daughter Markello was alive but critically injured. Marquavius Young was alive but seriously injured. Both of them needed more medical care than Tunica County's resources could provide. Markello was airlifted to Le Bonheur Children's Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Le Bonheur is the primary pediatric trauma center for the Mid-South, the hospital that handles the region's most critical injuries to children, equipped with the specialists and the technology that a 6-year-old with a gunshot wound requires. It is approximately an hour's drive from Robinsonville under normal circumstances, which is why the airlift existed. Because an hour on the ground is too long when a child's life is in the balance. Marquavius Young was airlifted to Regional 1 Health in Memphis, the regional adult trauma center, where his injuries could be addressed with the level of care they required. The home on Soleil Drive became a crime scene. The deputies began their investigation, and Markello Braxton was not there. He had fled. He was gone from the address before deputies arrived. The Tunica County Sheriff's Office immediately identified him as the suspect and issued a public alert. Armed and dangerous. Do not approach. Contact law enforcement with any information about his whereabouts. The community that neighbors had described as usually quiet. The kind of neighborhood where crime scene tape and police lights were not a familiar sight, absorbed the specific shock of learning what had been building at one of its addresses across a decade that most people on that street had spent without knowing the full picture of what was happening inside that house. The search for Braxton expanded beyond Tunica County, U.S. Marshals joined the effort. Deputies from multiple agencies worked the geography of the area around Soleil Drive. 3 days passed. Markello was in Le Bonheur. Marquavius was at Regional 1. Nykeria's family was navigating the specific and incomprehensible reality of a loss that arrives without adequate warning, even when the warning signs were visible for a decade. And Markello Braxton was somewhere in the landscape of northwest Mississippi, or so investigators believed, while the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies worked to find him. On July 14, 2025, at 4:41 in the afternoon, Deputies and U.S. Marshals Service officers located a body in a wooded area behind residences on Soleil Drive. The body was in the woods directly behind the street where Nykeria Jude had been killed 3 days earlier. It had a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Investigators, using the location and additional information from the investigation, linked the remains to Markello Braxton. The body was sent to the Mississippi Crime Lab in Jackson for formal identification. Markello Braxton, who had shot the mother of his youngest child and wounded both of his children on July 11th, had not traveled far. He had gone into the woods behind the houses on the same street, and he had not come out. The Tunica County Sheriff's Office, in the days following the discovery of Braxton's body, posted a statement on social media that did something important. They published the National Domestic Violence Hotline number. They said if anyone is currently experiencing domestic violence, please reach out to someone you trust for help. They provided both the sheriff's office number and the hotline. That statement, posted by a law enforcement agency that had responded to 7 calls at a single address over 10 years, is the institutional acknowledgement that what happened at 1060 Soleil Drive was not simply a crime. It was a domestic violence homicide, and the community around it deserves to know that resources exist and that those resources are available to people who are in situations like the one that built across 10 years on Soleil Drive. Ponia Dodson from Beauty Beyond the Scars, a domestic violence prevention advocacy organization that covers the Memphis and Mid-South area, spoke publicly about the case in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. She says it was a harsh reminder of domestic violence victims suffering until the most tragic event happens, death. That sentence, direct and unsoftened and accurate, is the advocacy community's distillation of what the research literature on intimate partner homicide confirms. Across thousands of documented cases, the trajectory from documented domestic disturbance to lethal violence is not inevitable in every case, but is documented frequently enough that the pattern of escalation, the arc from first call to last call, to the moment when no call can help anymore, is something that researchers and advocates and law enforcement professionals recognize and have been trying to interrupt for decades. 7 calls, the first in July 2015, the last in March 2025. The question that every person who looks at that record asks is the same question. What happened between those 7 calls? What did law enforcement find when they arrived each time? Were arrests made? Were protective orders issued? Were referrals to services offered? Was there any point in those 10 years when the intervention that arrived at 1060 Soleil Drive was the kind of intervention that could have changed the trajectory that ended on July 11th? The public record does not answer all of those questions. The specific outcomes of each of the 7 calls, whether arrests occurred, whether charges were filed, whether orders of protection were put in place, are not detailed in the available reporting. What the record confirms is that 7 calls happened, and that the situation at that address was known to the Tunica County Sheriff's Office across a decade-long documented history. The gap between what was known and what was prevented is the central and most painful question this case leaves behind. Researchers who study the effectiveness of law enforcement response to domestic violence calls have documented a consistent set of challenges that agencies across the country face in translating call response into lasting safety for the people involved. Arrest alone, without follow-through in the form of prosecution, services, and accountability measures, has limited long-term effect on the risk of future violence. Protective orders are only as effective as their enforcement and as meaningful as the victim's access to support that makes leaving and maintaining distance viable. Referrals to domestic violence services are most effective when those services are accessible, funded, and staffed in ways that allow them to respond with urgency, rather than with the months-long wait lists that characterize under-resourced rural service environments. Tunica County, Mississippi is not a county with abundant domestic violence resources. It is one of the poorest counties in the United States. The domestic violence shelters and advocacy organizations that serve its residents are primarily located in larger cities like Memphis, Tennessee, just across the state line. The distance between a woman in Robinsonville who needs immediate safe housing and the nearest available shelter bed is not simply geographic. It is the distance between a situation with no immediately visible exit and the organizational resources that could help create one. That distance, in rural Mississippi, in one of the most economically underserved corners of the country, is part of the systemic picture that the 7 documented calls at 1060 Soleil Drive belong inside. None of this is an argument that Nykeria Jude did not recognize the danger she was in or did not want help. The research on why victims of ongoing intimate partner violence do not leave or do not maintain separation is not a research literature about naivety or passivity. It is a research literature about the real and documented barriers that make leaving, for many women in many situations, not simply a decision but a logistical, financial, social, and safety challenge that requires resources and support that are not always available. Co-parenting with an abusive partner does not end when the romantic relationship ends. The child is the ongoing thread of connection, the need to navigate shared parenthood, to allow the father of your child access to that child, to maintain some level of communication with a person who is also the source of danger, is one of the most consistently documented traps in the full landscape of intimate partner violence. Nykeria Jude was living inside that trap for the years those 7 calls document. She was not the trap's author. She was its occupant. Now let's talk about what came after. Because the aftermath of July 11th, 2025 on Soleil Drive is not simply the story of a crime and an investigation. It is the story of 2 children recovering in Memphis hospitals, a family navigating a loss that arrived with all the specific brutality of a domestic violence homicide, and a community processing the specific grief of learning that something it did not fully see had been building at one of its addresses for a decade. Marquavius Young was released from Regional 1 Health on the Sunday following the shooting. He had survived. He had been shot by his father, the man who was also the father of his 6-year-old sister, and he had survived. The spokesperson who spoke on his behalf, and on behalf of Angela and Leon, Marlesia's maternal grandparents, issued a statement that is one of the most honest and most complicated pieces of public communication in the entire record of this case. The statement said their family faced an unimaginable loss with the passing of Nykeria Jude. It said that both Nykeria and Markello were loving parents to Marlesia. It said Markello was also the father to Marquavius. It said that in a heartbreaking turn of events, both children suffered injuries at the hands of their father. And it said that the discovery of Markello's body on July 15th left families and friends grappling with a whirlwind of emotions, from sorrow to confusion. Sorrow and confusion. That is the honest description of what a family is left with when the person who caused the harm is also someone they loved. The person who killed Nykeria Jude was also Marlesia's father and Marquavius's father. The person who shot both of his children was also described by the people who knew him as a loving parent. Both of those things exist in the same statement, in the same reality, because that is what the reality actually contains. Grief for Nykeria. Grief in a different and more complicated form for the man who killed her and then disappeared into the woods. Confusion about how someone who loved his children could also have done this to them. The specific disorientation of a loss that is also a betrayal, that is also a grief that does not resolve into any of the familiar shapes, because the person at the center of it was simultaneously the person you loved and the person who destroyed your family. That complexity is not a defense of what happened at 1060 Soleil Drive on July 11th. It is the honest documentation of how families experience the specific form of loss that domestic violence homicide produces. They are not left with a clear villain and a clear victim and a clean grief that points in one direction. They are left with the wreckage of something that was built over 10 years, and that ended in a way that touched every person connected to both of the adults at the center of it. Marlesia lost her mother. Marlesia lost her father. She is 6 years old. She will be carrying the weight of July 11th, 2025 in some form for the rest of her life. On Tuesday, July 15th, 2025, Markello Braxton was discharged from Le Bonheur Children's Hospital in Memphis. She was going home to her grandparents Angela and Leon. She had survived. She was 6 years old and she had survived being shot, survived the airlift, survived the days in the pediatric unit while her mother's funeral was being arranged, and her father's body was being identified in a Mississippi crime lab. She was going home. The Tunica County Sheriff's Office and the sheriffs of Shelby County, DeSoto County, Coahoma County, and Tunica County did something that the public record captures and that deserves to be named specifically as the human response it was. They organized a police escort for Marlesia's journey home. deputies from 4 separate county sheriff's offices formed a procession that accompanied the car carrying a 6-year-old girl from a Memphis Children's Hospital back to Robinsonville, Mississippi. That escort, multiple jurisdictions, multiple agencies, multiple deputies who did not have to do this but chose to do it, is the public record's most visible expression of what the community understood had happened on Soleil Drive. Not just a crime, not just a statistic, a child coming home without her mother, surrounded by the people with the authority to escort her, because they understood that what she had survived deserved to be marked and that the journey home deserved to be protected. Nykeria Jude was 30 years old. She was the mother of a 6-year-old girl who was airlifted to Le Bonheur and came home to her grandparents with a police escort from 4 counties. She was in an on and off relationship with a man whose documented history with her at that address spans 10 years. She was living in one of the most economically underserved counties in the United States, where the distance between her situation and the resources that might have changed its outcome was measured not just in miles, but in funding and staffing and the specific political will to invest in rural domestic violence services that is rarely present when the community in question is poor and black and far from the centers of institutional attention. She deserved more than 7 calls across 10 years. She deserved an intervention that arrived with the resources and the sustained follow-through that 7 documented disturbances at a single address should have triggered. She deserved a system that saw the pattern those 7 calls created and responded to the pattern rather than to each individual call in isolation. She deserved to be alive when Markello came home from Le Bonheur on July 15th. The Tunica County Sheriff's Office has not released detailed information about what occurred during each of the 7 documented calls, what charges, if any, were filed, and what services, if any, were offered. The investigation into the events of July 11th is ongoing. The Mississippi Crime Lab completed the identification of Braxton's remains. The case has no pending criminal proceedings because the person who committed the violence is deceased. What remains is the family, the community, the grandparents raising Markello. Marquavius, who survived being shot by his father and is now navigating whatever recovery looks like when the loss is also this complicated. And the advocates and the researchers and the people who cover cases like this one and who refuse to allow them to be processed briefly and forgotten quickly because the community they came from is rural and poor and black and far from the places where attention tends to gather. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-7233. Free and confidential 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by call, text, and chat at thehotline.org. In Mississippi, the Mississippi Coalition Against Domestic Violence can be reached at 1-800-898-3234. Resources exist. They are not always as close or as accessible as they need to be, but they exist. And knowing they exist is the beginning of being able to reach them. Subscribe to the Crime Files TV. Share this video for Nykeria, for Markello, who came home with a 4-county escort, for Marquavius, who survived and is carrying something enormous, for Angela and Leon, who are raising their granddaughter and holding their family together in the aftermath of a July evening on Soleil Drive that changed everything. 10 years of warning signs, 7 calls, one night that nobody on that street saw coming, even though the record said it was always possible.